According to the book of Sefer Yetzirah, which is a very ancient book of Jewish mysticism of Kabbalah, there are three primary letters, three mother letters in the Hebrew alphabet. The alphabet itself the Hebrew Aleph base has 22 letters. There are 7 double letters, which are letters that both can be pronounced in its harsh form and a lighter form, as for example the letter Bays. So Bays can be pronounced as a Bays or a Vase. Translated into English, that would be an example of a B and a V. Then there are the 12 simple letters, which corresponds to the 12 months of the year. And then there are the 3 primary letters, the 3 mother letters, and they are Aleph, Mem, and Shin. And according to the deeper reading of this text, the Aleph is the beginning of sound, the Mem is the conclusion of sound, and the Shin is the synthesis between sound and silence. So the first sound and the beginning of all sound is the opening of the mouth. And when the mouth becomes open, the first sound of breath, which is the Hey sound, that develops into an actual sound is the sound of Aleph, is Ah. So when you pronounce the letter Aleph with the Patach vowel, the vowel that creates the letter of Ah, that's the mouth is open. So the beginning of sound is with the mouth open is the Aleph sound, the Ah sound. The end of sound, which represents the silence, is the Mem, because when you pronounce the letter Mem, you close your mouth. It's Mem. And the end of that sound is a closed sound, and that represents the ending of sound, or the silence of sound. And the sound of Shin, or Sh, is the balance between the sound, the opening of the mouth, and the closing of the mouth in the Mem. And these are 3 very primary letters and 3 primary sounds. One is the sound of voice, one is the sound of silence, and one is the balance between sound and silence. If we look at the beginning of the creation story in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshit, we'll see that the way, the medium through which creation arises is through sound. Vayomer Hashem bihi or, and Hashem said, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So creation comes about through sound. Sound is movement, a vibration. The beginning of creation is a vibration. Any movement is a creation from oneness. There's a unity within the Creator of the Ein Sof, the infinite light. And once there's a desire to create, that's already a movement within the Creator to create something outside of itself. And that is represented in sound. So first there's a spiritual vibration of a sound. This spiritual vibration of a sound creates a physical vibration. The physical vibration is the energy, and that gives rise to matter. So when you look at a table and a chair, or a stone, and you say, what is the stone? The stone is a physical property of matter, which is a condensed form of energy, which is a certain vibration. And this is a reflection of a spiritual vibration of the Hebrew letters that spell the word Evan, Aleph, Beis, Nun, which means stone. So the stone is a manifestation of a spiritual vibration of these formation of these letters. And everything in creation is in fact a vibration, a spiritual vibration that's reflected and manifests as a physical vibration. That's why in Hebrew we actually have no word for things. In Hebrew, words for things are called davar, which means a speech. Everything is a vibration. So creation is a movement, and movement is vibration and speech. What comes before the vibration, what precedes the sound, is the silence. And that's the movement that occurs within the mind. So first there's a movement within the mind to speak, and then there's the actual speech. So creation, Dibur, is connected with the fullness of creation, with the manifestation of creation, time, space, consciousness. And silence represents a consciousness that's beyond time and space. And then the Shin, which is the balance between these two, is the balance between the sound and the silence. So essentially, there are 2 ways that we can relate to creation. We can relate to the creation as an ayin, an emptiness, a nothingness that gives rise to a yesh, which is a somethingness. And therefore we experience creation in its fullness. We experience our relationship with the Creator in the fullness, in the sound of life. And then there's a perspective where we're going from the yesh, from the fullness of creation, back into the ayin, into the emptiness, which we experience the divine in the emptiness and in silence. And these are very two important practices. Either we're experiencing the divine, experiencing the Creator, experiencing Hashem in the fullness of creation, which is in the sound of life, or we're experiencing in the retreat from the mundane of life into the place of silence. And these are two practices. And because the shin represents the balance between these two, and incidentally the word Shema, which is a very important word in Judaism, the idea of Shema Yisrael, listen Israel, the Hashem is one. The word Shema is comprised of these three letters, which is the shin, the mem, and the ayin, which is interchangeable with the letter aleph. They both come from the throat. So the idea of balancing these two, so to experience fullness of life is to experience sound, to experience the transcendence of life is to experience silence. And both of these points are very important. And every time there's an emergence of deeper Kabbalistic wisdom that's revealed into the world, whether it was in the 1300s or in the 1500s with the Arizal, Rise Gloria, or in the late 1700s with the emergence of Chassidut, with the Baal Shem Tov, there's always an emergence also of song and of music, because we're going to relate to Hashem, we're going to relate to the divine in the fullness of life. And part of the fullness of life is to relate to God in the poetry and in the music and in the sound of creation. And certainly with the teachings and the emergence of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, which is a very embodied practice, which is to experience the divine in the immediate of life and the immediacy of life, there was a resurgence of Jewish music and a resurgence of music in general. And interestingly, a type of music that developed over the past few hundred years is called a nigun. Now, it's a very ancient way of singing, but there's something interesting about this idea of a nigun. A nigun is spelled with three Hebrew letters, nun, gimel, nun. And very interestingly enough, the nun, gimel, nun could be spelled backwards and forwards, which means that a nigun is something that is continuous. Now, if you look at classic Western music, in contrast to Eastern music, you'll see a very strong distinction. That in Western music, and this is collectively all Western music, there's a beginning, there's a very clear narrative. There's a beginning, there's an end, and there's a climax. In Eastern music, for example, or other culture music besides in the West, music is repetitive. It's a song that continuously repeats itself. There's no climax. It comes to an end and then repeats itself back into the beginning. This dynamic of the difference between music that's following a linear progression versus cyclical music is really related to the culture and the understanding of life that emerges in the East versus in the West. In the Western tradition, one of the great understandings of life is that life is not cyclical, that history is not just repetitive, but history actually is progressive. There's a creation, there's a beginning story, there's a revelation, there's a mid-story, and then there's redemption, there's a movement towards a utopia and a perfect era. And as a reflection to that, the music that's created from a subconscious of the Western person is also following that same order. We start off with a beginning, then there's a middle, and then there's an ending. In the East, which was generally a much older civilization in terms of their perception of how the world is created and the way life works, is it's more cyclical, that time doesn't follow a linear progression, but follows a cyclical progression, which is that things are just repetitive constantly. What happens will be, and life just is continuously cycle. In the cyclical understanding of life, the music that's produced is also very cyclical. There's something very interesting and unique about a nigun, which is a Hasidic or a Kabbalistic, a spiritual type of nigun, is that it combines both. And that's really the synthesis, which we talked about earlier, between the aleph, which is sound, movement. Movement follows progression. Creation is movement, and then moving towards redemption. Versus the mem, which is silence, which is the absence of life, or the immediacy of life that is always absent in the emptiness of everything, which will be more like a circle, and nothing really occurs. Everything is just imaginary. And then there's the balance between these two is the shin. And this is a very strong dynamic of the nigun. That the nigun both starts at a certain point. You start a nigun, you start at a certain juncture. It reaches a climax, but when it reaches a climax, the song doesn't end. it actually merges into a repetitive sound. So if you had to imagine this in terms of a visual, instead of seeing it as a cycle or as a line, you would see it more as a spiral. So every movement is following a circle line, but every movement, every time you're reaching that movement on the same point, you're actually reaching it on a higher place. And that's the true definition of nigun, because the understanding is that these two concepts are both true. Creation both began at a certain point, and that at every moment creation is reoccurring. There is a beginning to creation, and there's an end to creation, and there's a beginning and end at every single moment. And that's the synthesis of this type of music. And this is the uniqueness of the nigun, that we're in depth into the moment of that song, wherever that is present in the immediate moment, in the eternal present of that moment. And yet we're also following a progression of forward in the belief that we're getting towards a certain direction and we're reaching towards our collective redemption.